goal is to convince you that an investigation into the question of whether there is life after death is well worth our time, and perhaps the most important question you could ever consider. Okay? So why are we talking about it? Well, despite being in an increasingly secular, and I mean non-religious society, we're still very much concerned with the afterlife. And so in 2014, there was an academic study, a combo of a bunch of universities, and this is how the study reported its findings. It says, in recent years, fewer Americans prayed, believed in God, took the Bible literally, attended religious services, identified as religious, affiliated with a religion, or had confidence in religious institutions. The large declines in religious practice among young adults also further evidence that millennials are the least religious generation in memory, and possibly in American history. All right? So that's the overall picture. Yet, 80% of Americans said that they believe in an afterlife, and that's up from 73% 20 years ago. And so it's interesting that fewer people participate in religious expression, but more believe in an afterlife. It's a very interesting dynamic. The psychologist who leads the team of researchers suggested that it might be part of a growing entitlement mentality, thinking you can get something for nothing. All that to say is that we're thinking about the afterlife, and we may not be thinking about it in that careful of a way. All right, and these numbers, they've probably fallen since then, and so it's probably fallen off by about 10% in terms of Americans who would believe in the afterlife. But what the studies have continued to show is that there's still a strong percentage of Americans that continue to believe, and that the numbers transcend socio-political boundaries. And so if you go across political groups or economic groups or racial or ethnic groups, the numbers continue to be very high in terms of belief in an afterlife. And so we're all thinking about it. There's a similar fascination when it comes to the afterlife when it relates to the human experience or the study of near-death experience. You probably know this just from your own kind of cultural engagement, that the number of books, documentaries, movies about near-death experiences are astounding. And we're not going to spend any time tonight evaluating or examining those type of accounts, but it's another point where the experience is broad. And so according to a Gallup poll, about 8 million Americans claim to have had a near-death experience, and many of them regard this experience as proof of an afterlife. And so Raymond Moody, who wrote Life After Life back in 1975, really one of the first near-death experience books. Since then, there's been many. So he wrote this book years ago, and about 7 years ago, he talked to CNN, and he said that among his experience with people, this conviction about an afterlife and the experience of a near-death experience transcended the particulars of religion. And so he said a lot of people talk about encountering a being of light. Christians call it Christ. Jewish people say it's an angel. I've gone to different continents, and you can hear the same thing in China, India, and Japan about meeting a being of complete love and compassion. I only bring that up anecdotally to say, once again, this question of life after death and some sort of yearning and hope and perhaps even experience of it is fairly common, perhaps the most common of all human experiences. And so it's not surprising then that religions and worldviews would seek to answer the question of after death. And I limit it in that way because not all speak of life after death, but all seek to answer the question of after death, what is there? And so from a biblical perspective, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, it explains it this way, that God has put eternity into man's hearts, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. And so from a biblical perspective, we were created or designed to search for eternity, and yet on our own, we cannot find it out. We can't figure it out. And so this is the dynamic I would suggest we see in play with how the religions approach the question of life after death. And so if you've been around me, you know I love this particular diagram, but I find it so useful. And so basically we have on the bottom here a known experience, our life on this world, and up here we have an unknown. Or at the bottom here, we have experience, and up here we have transcendence. And generally speaking, from human experience, we're trying to do this. We're trying to expand our known experience, trying to expand our knowledge, And so that's certainly what we do in science and observation. It's what we do in philosophy. And so beyond just scientific observation, we're seeking to understand. And often this is what we're doing with the religious experience. We're seeking to expand up. Some religions then go and claim revelation. That there's some sort of message or experience or influence that crosses the line from above to give knowledge or to give experience. And so this is the dynamic we're going to see at play tonight, and we'll come back to this diagram later. But in general, when we're thinking about religions, it might be helpful to kind of think through your mind about the types of religions we generally experience. And so we have monotheistic religions, so religions that believe in one God, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, some examples. We have polytheism. A lot of the ancient religions were like this, so the Roman and Greek mythologies. Hinduism can be like this. We have pantheism, as in God is everywhere. Buddhism and Hinduism tends toward that. We have animism, and so it's this worship of non-human beings like plants, animals, or the natural world. And so Shintoism tends towards that. Atheism, of course, a belief of no God. We can also compare kind of historic religions, so religions that especially require an event happening in history. And so Islam is like that with the revelation to Muhammad. Judaism is like that. Christianity is like that. Or there's other religions that are more philosophical, more a way of seeing the world, not as closely tied to historical events. And so Buddhism and Hinduism could be like that. And so how do we compare these different religions? How do we look at how they view the afterlife and fairly actually evaluate? Well, generally, you could think of a worldview as the attempt to explain reality. The way you view the world, the way you understand the world, is your attempt to explain your reality, and religions are often the core of a person's worldview. And so what should your religion answer? And so there's a philosopher, James Sire, who suggests a series of questions that a good religion, not a good religion, a series of questions that most religions would seek to answer. So what is the prime reality? So what is really real? What is the nature of external reality? What's going on with the world around us? What is a human being? Who are we? Why is it possible to know anything at all? Question of knowledge, or truth. How do we know right or wrong, ethics or morality? What happens to a person after death? And then closely tied to that, what is the meaning of human history? In general, these are the questions that religions are seeking to answer. And so as we seek to understand religions, we need to consider the difference between evidence and explanation. So evidence, especially when it comes to what you can think of as historical religions, is you can look back in history and examine evidence to see what happened. And so this is a big one for Christianity. It's a big one for Islam as well. And so we try to get eyewitness accounts, or do we get physical signs like archaeology? And so we look back and we try to examine what has happened. But often more strongly with religions is this idea of explanation. And so it's the story or the events that explain what's going on. And in the case of the afterlife, it's how this historical or philosophical religion, like both times, how they explain our experience with life and our desire and hope after death. Okay? So now we're going to kind of go into an overview of how many kind of the big world religions view the afterlife. And a qualification here. I don't want to strongly claim what the religions believe. And so the reason is because there tends to be a lot of variety, both between official belief and differences between regions and sects. And so these religions are varied. And so it's hard to really make a claim in summary about what they believe. There also tends to be a decent amount of variety between kind of expert or professional understanding versus common understanding. And so you probably experienced this. You had in your mind what a religion believed, and then you talk to somebody who affiliates with that religion, and they might believe something slightly differently. And so that's just the reality of what we're up against. And so we'll try to present a summary view, but do it kind of with a little bit of grace. And so how do we organize if we're going to think through the world religions? Perhaps you realize this, but at least in the United States, Christianity is still by far the most common religion. And so as recently as last year, at least 65 to 70% of people in the United States claimed affiliation with Christianity. It's still that high. 46% or so would claim to be Protestant, 20% Roman Catholic, and then less than 1% Orthodox. And so Christianity by far is the major association within the United States, but that's less so in the broader world, as you could expect. And so in the broader world, Christianity is about 30%, and then other major religions fall close under that. And so that's actually how we're going to organize our time. We're going to save Christianity to the end because that's my cup of tea there. But we'll start then with the second most broad religion. And so this is Islam. About 23% of the world affiliates with Islam, 1.8 billion people. So 23% in the world compared to 1% in the US. And so a pretty drastic difference there. And so in general, the basics of Islam is it is a historical monotheistic religion, right? So rooted in history, belief in one God, founded around 1610 AD in Mecca in Arabia, right? Core beliefs, one God, so there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. And so one of the core beliefs of Islam is that Muhammad has been given the final and supreme revelation from God. And so Muslims believe that God has revealed himself through history in Moses, Abraham, even Jesus, but then he has corrected and clarified in a final and supreme way through the prophet Muhammad. And so this final revelation was dictated more or less through the written word of the Quran. And then it was explained through commentaries in the Sunnah and the Hadith. All right? So these were reports of the sayings or the behaviors of Muhammad. And so really Islam bases its practice, its schools of law, on that historical event, revelation to Muhammad, and then commentaries and sayings of how he continued to express that. And so Islam is a religion founded upon duty and service to Allah. And so everything, ethics and worldview, come from submission to God. And so they believe that Allah in his mercy has cleared up these errors of Judaism and Christianity with this final revelation. All right? And so the branches of Islam that you may hear about, they're mainly differences based around questions of succession. So who's carrying on the message after Muhammad? And so that's kind of a general view. In terms of practices, there's really 5 pillars that Muslims believe. A witness of the faith, and so declaration of faith in God and belief in Muhammad, ritual prayer, fasting during the month of Ramadan, charity as in generosity, and then pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in a person's life. And so how does Islam explain death? Well, in Islam, life is a test in preparation for the afterlife. So in Islam, life is a test in preparation for the afterlife. And so death is the separation of the soul from the body to await judgment about that test. And so in that way, death is seen as the gateway to the afterlife. And every person has the ability to prepare for the next life. Right? And so what do they believe about the afterlife? Well, they believe in a full physical resurrection at what they describe as the Last Judgment, often described as a return of a Muhammad-like prophet, and sometimes even associated with Jesus. Okay? That eternal destiny of people will be determined by weighing good and bad, and discipline to Allah leads to favor, and he might tip the scale one way or the other. And so there's paradise for the saved, and some version of hell for those who are judged. And in between, there's an intermediate state where the final judgment is reflected kind of in the intermediate state. And some versions of Islam believe in a process of purification, that for the minor wrongs or the minor sins, there's a time of purification where you could be purified toward paradise rather than towards hell. All right? So broad view, Islam, monotheistic, one God, destiny in the future afterlife very much determined by God and very much works-based in the sense that your life is judged based on a comparison of good and bad, but Allah has the final say. And so in this way, actually, Muslims don't strictly believe that only Muslims go to heaven, rather that Allah gets to determine, but yet Allah has revealed the final word through Muhammad. And so that's how Islam views the afterlife. Okay, next in the world of religions, we have Hinduism. 15% in the world, about 900 million people, primarily in India, 0.5% in the US. Some of these percentages are really surprising because, especially where we live, of course, you know people who practice and believe these different religions. Okay? Hinduism is more of a philosophical religion, so a way of life. It's mostly a pantheistic religion, and so the idea that God is present everywhere or deity is present everywhere. There are some polytheism ideas, and so there are gods and goddesses. It's a very old religion, developed in about the 2nd millennium BC, so think around 2,000 years BC. Very old, but also a lot of variety. And of all these religions, trying to summarize what Hinduism is actually really, really difficult. But in general, Hindus believe that God is the absolute or universal spirit. And so this is Brahman. And so God is this universal cosmic spirit, and that then different gods or goddesses are manifestations of that spirit, a kind of like department heads underneath. Not really people of a holy book. And so in comparison to Christianity or Islam, not really people of one book. Rather, there are hundreds of Hindu scriptures, and they're mainly stories that lead to liberation of the soul versus leading to particular doctrine. And so the Hindu scriptures are primarily stories that lead to the liberation of your soul rather than lead to particular doctrine. And so, Hinduism is this belief that all human souls are a part of Brahman, this big cosmic soul. It's called Atman, actually. So we are Atman, kind of like sparks off the main fire of Brahman. Right? And so the chief end then is to liberate from the bodily existence and arrive at the common consciousness. And so this is why reincarnation is such a big part of Hinduism, and often also why karma is a big idea. Karma not in terms of destiny, but rather in terms of cause and effect, the laws that govern the world. And so the chief end is to liberate from bodily experience and to arrive at association with the cosmic soul. And that's how the caste system works in Hinduism as well. You want to move up, eventually moving to the point where you are released. And so the different branches, the different parts of Hinduism generally differ in how personal or impersonal they understand the cosmic soul Brahman to be. And so that's kind of the main difference of a wide variety of Hinduism. And so how does this belief then lead to life for a Hindu? So what are the core practices? Well, they strive to achieve dharma, which is this code of living that emphasizes good conduct and morality. And so if you're looking for cause and effect, and your ultimate goal is to level up isn't the right word. The ultimate goal is to cycle through life with reincarnation so that then you can be liberated from bodily existence, then your conduct on this life is super important. And so there's a high value of all life and a high value of care and compassion. They view suffering as a given, but it can also be caused by attachment to material things. And so holding on too tightly. And so how do they explain death? Well, we go through life cycles, wandering as a soul journeys from one life to another until achieving liberation, moksha, liberation. And so death is a natural effect of this wandering. It's the negative effect of karma giving us the opportunity to work and wander towards liberation. And liberation is kind of seen as like this raindrop falling into the ocean. And so joining the cosmic soul. And so the view of the afterlife then is obviously greatly influenced by that. Some versions of Hinduism have kind of a theistic view, and so there are god and goddesses. And in those views, there's an idea of heaven or hell that's kind of a temporary staging point until your next reincarnation. And so if you've done pretty well, you could have a resting time in heaven before you're reincarnated. And if you've done really poorly, you could have a challenging time in a hell-type place. But the overall goal is to work up and to release into kind of a cosmic soul. That's the pantheism idea. Okay? Buddhism's next. About 7% in the world, 470 million, 1% in the United States. Similar to Hinduism, very philosophical, very much a way of life, pantheistic, if anything. And so a lot of Buddhists will claim to not believe in a god or a divine being. but in practice it's pretty similar to pantheism. It was started about 500 years BC in Nepal by the Buddha, and you may know this. So one of the core beliefs is that Buddhism, it shares a lot of similarities with Hinduism in the sense that its goals are similar, but the means of getting to those goals are very different. In this way, it's kind of a reformation from Hinduism, a split off. And so it's rooted in history in a sense that the Buddha experienced an enlightenment where he realized that souls were having this illusion of being reincarnated and floating through eternity, bound in ignorance and suffering senselessly from one body to another. So 500 BC, the original Buddha had an enlightenment where he figured this out. And so therefore he split off from Hinduism in the sense that he looked at the world and he wanted to clarify 4 basic truths. Okay? That there's suffering, that the cause of suffering is desire, that if we cease desiring, we will cease suffering, and the right path then leads to cessation of suffering. And so in a sense, a very practical approach to life, and many people who practice Buddhism, especially in the US or in Western cultures, would find it to be a very simple religion. And if you talk to somebody, that might be how they describe it to you. And so there's these 4 kind of noble truths that would allow somebody, in theory, to find this middle way between poverty and a lavish lifestyle. So this right way of life. And so then the Eightfold Path, if you've heard of that, is this right way of living. And so right understanding, right thinking, right speaking, right action, right livelihood, right endeavor, right mindfulness, right concentration. And so once again, you're going through life, reincarnation, working to achieve a state of nothingness. Nirvana is how it's described, a permanent end to the rebirth, a permanent end to the suffering, by going through this right path and achieving a proper view of suffering, a decrease of desire to where then suffering ceases. Okay? Buddhism has an interesting part to where there's this doctrine of assimilation where the belief system of other religions are blended into Buddhism. And so that's kind of peculiar or individual to Buddhism, is that so many people who claim Buddhism will also claim other parts of other religions pretty easily. And so once again, so what is the core practice then? Well, you wouldn't be surprised that then if you believe this, the way this practically lives out is a lot in terms of restraining desire. If suffering is primarily caused by desire, then your activity in the world is primarily restraining desire. And so the 5 silas, as they're called, it's refrain from killing, refrain from theft, refrain from sexual misconduct, refrain from lying or evil speech, and refrain from illicit drugs or liquor. And so it's really these ethical behaviors over right beliefs. The right beliefs aren't as critical as the ethical behaviors to allow yourself to work through the four pillars. And so it's very much a practice of human effort in the sense that you earn your place within nirvana, that your fate is not in the hands of a deity, but by living life according to the principles that the Buddha discovered. And so how do they explain death? Well, death is just the natural part of the life cycle. It's just the gateway to rebirth. Suffering is caused by desire or ignorance. And so this is why meditation as a practice is so central in Buddhism, to where you're trying to right your relationship with yourself and with desire. Okay? So in the afterlife, the goal of Buddhism is to attain nirvana, enlightenment. And so you stop with the suffering by living according to these principles. You're reincarnated according to karma, eventually getting to the point where you are enlightened to the point of release. Okay? So Hinduism and Buddhism both share this view of the afterlife, that there is after, but it's not personal, individual life, or even community life in that way. Okay? And as you think about it, Buddhism and Hinduism together make about 1.5 billion people in the world, a lot less in the United States, but certainly a lot in the world. All right, Judaism. This one's interesting because Judaism in the world is actually much smaller, so only 0.2% of the world population, about 14 million people. But in the United States, it's up to 1.4, and so this is a case where a percentage in the US is higher than broadly in the world. And I would say in New England, and perhaps in Fairfield County, this is especially true. And so we live among many Jewish people. Judaism, similar to Hinduism, is that it's hard to summarize what the Jewish people believe because there's a lot of variety. But in general, historical, so rooted in history, monotheistic, if theistic at all, old, and so they would trace the roots at least back to 2000 BC. Core belief, kind of in the big picture, is one God, Yahweh, who made a covenant with one people, Israel. And so through this, he then reveals himself through Moses, and he gives his word to his people through primarily the Torah. And so Jewish people hold the Torah very highly, and then the Talmud, which is a description or explanation of the Torah. And so this Torah and then the description of the Torah through the Talmud is the direction for life. It's the way to please God. It's the way to be God's people. And so in this way, Judaism, although rooted in history, is especially a communal event, a way of life. And this is especially true in modern Judaism, where some of the core beliefs might be less hold compared to the community experience. And so this is why kosher and Sabbath are things that keep demonstrating who they are. Just in general, 3 branches of Judaism from your experience, if you're in the city or if you're out here. Orthodox, very simplified, keeps everything as if it were meant to be kept. And so Orthodox really wants to keep everything as it was originally given. Conservative maintains that Judaism should be reinterpreted to a limited degree to the present situation. So conservative keeps it, but wants to reinterpret it for the present day. The Reform movement is basically a response to modern secularism, which emphasizes the ethical ideas of Judaism rather than the externals. And so much more about ethics than about the actual commands in the Torah. And so when it comes to death and the afterlife, there's actually a really wide variety. And so some do believe in a physical resurrection with a heaven or a hell. Others see salvation as primarily improving society. And that might be our primary experience in Fairfield County, for instance. Finally, before we get to Christianity, in the U.S. at least, about 24% of people would identify as religious nones, N-O-N-E. And so no religious affiliation. Only about 3% of them would be atheists, would identify as atheists, no God. The assumption is that the others would be indifferent or perhaps be agnostic, don't know. In a way, as we think about this category, and it's the fastest growing religious category in the U.S., nones, no affiliation. As we think about them, it would be fair, I think, to consider them to be both philosophical and historical. That often they're evaluating either no belief in God or indifference to God based on how they see history playing out and based on how they see a way to live. And so it's kind of a combination of both. Atheism in particular, of course, would claim a lack of a belief in gods. Okay? Most atheists will be very careful about this. It's not about knowing. It's not about not being able to believe. It's not even about saying there are no gods. The atheist is saying that they don't believe in a God. And so to be fair and charitable to them, it'd be helpful to realize that. But of course, this viewpoint, this belief, plays out in practice to where in terms of practice, natural, ethical ideas are usually what drives life. And when it comes to afterlife, well, there is none. And so afterlife is nothing. After death is nothing. Cessation of consciousness or existence. But there's a variety in terms of how people experience that. All right, so these are the ideas we have going around us. By and far, both in the present and throughout human history, the belief in some form of afterlife has been dominant. C.S. Lewis makes a Christian author from the past decades, makes a very helpful point, I think, to say that to be a current atheist and to claim such for other people would actually be historically and intellectually pretty bold. It would be pretty bold to say that most of human history and most of the world have gotten it wrong on this. And so we come to Christianity. I'm going to try to give a similar type of overview in a similar way to kind of be fair and charitable, and then we'll go through kind of a more familiar pitch about how the Bible talks about the afterlife. So 31% of the world and 67% in the U.S. identify as Christian, 2 billion plus people. Okay? Certainly historical, rooted in history, and so you can kind of In pencil, you can think of Christianity as rooted in the 1st century AD, but Christianity claims foundation from the Old Testament Judaism. Core beliefs, and this is where we'll get back to our diagram here. So core beliefs of Christianity is in a personal, relational creator God. Personal and relational, both in contrast to the kind of Eastern religions and in contrast to Islam. In Islam, Allah is unknowable, which is why associating anything else with Allah is so unforgivable. But Christianity is very different in that way, that Christians believe in a personal, relational God. The Trinity is a big deal, especially in contrast to other religions. That Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, same God in 3 persons, was there at the creation, and he created a people, a place with a purpose. So he created the earth. He created people on it in his image, and he gave them a purpose, both to be connected to him and to be his representatives and vice rulers in the world. Okay? And so this is how Christianity understands who God is and who we are. And so then Christians believe that the problem with what's wrong with the world, and so death and suffering, the problem is sin. And so once again, in contrast, Christians believe in a personal evil, both in the sense of the devil, who is enemy of God and tempter of humanity, but also in sin being personalized in human beings. And so not just general wrong, but actually personal wrong, both in terms of action, but also attitude. And so, for instance, in Islam, sin is only action. There's no idea of original sin or attitude against God. It's only what you do, which is why the need for atonement or dealing with sin is very different. But Christians believe from Genesis that sin started as humanity rejected God, said, not your way, my way. And so because of that, we separated ourselves both naturally from the source of life and spiritually from the closeness. And so in Genesis then, human beings were created with the possibility of immortality, but not immortal. And so humanity's life is dependent on God. And so this is how Christians understand the world, is that because of the separation from God, who is good and perfect, and the source of life, then the result is death. And so really the rest of the story of Christianity and how we get to the afterlife is that God had a gracious and redemptive plan to save humanity. And so the basic storyline is one of Revelation. One of Revelation where God made himself known across the line, not only known in a kind of personal, knowable sense, but known in a saving sense, known in a gracious sense, one who would actually forgive and deal with sin. And so we see this come to a climax in history in the person of Jesus in the 1st century. That's why Christianity is so critically a historical religion. And so the Bible says that Jesus became a human, so he shared with humanity's plight, and then on the cross he took humanity's curse. And so sin that would have separated us from the source of life and brought judgment went upon Jesus, and so he took on spiritual death, the separation from God, and physical death, the result of sin and separation. And so he took it all, and then here we get to why Easter is so important, that when he took it all and then he rose from the dead, he actually demonstrated conquering of these things. So conquering of sin. Sin wouldn't keep him dead, although it has everyone else. Death was not final for him, even though it was for everyone else. And the devil, the great enemy of humanity, was not conquering him. And the way Christians go on from this to talk about the afterlife then is that Jesus and his resurrection is in that way the first fruit of new resurrection. And so his resurrection is the prototype, if you will, or the first fruit of ours. And so a new body, reconnection of soul and body in a real person, in close intimacy with God, yet on the physical earth in his initial resurrected state. And so that's kind of the same overall picture. And so in terms of practices, you can then understand why association with, belief in, and following of the person of Jesus is so central to Christians. Because the story of human history of God dealing with death and suffering and everything that comes with it, sin, is made known through Jesus. So if you want to do we're going to do a really quick summary here, all right? We're going to do a really quick summary of afterlife in the Bible. Maybe 5-10 minutes, and then we'll break and we'll do some questions. So if you go through the storyline of the Bible then in a little bit more detail, so death was not the design. That is very much clear in the Bible that even though humans were not given mortality as a given, death wasn't the design. And so as you read the Old Testament, for instance, you may hear about Sheol, the place of the dead or the grave. It's generally a negative. Sheol is a hard term to understand in the Old Testament because it really only shows up in the Old Testament. We only have one example of Sheol being used in other Near Ancient literature that's not in the Bible. And so to understand what it means, you really have to just work with the Old Testament. But this place of the dead, the grave, is not the place where you want to be. It's a negative. And so you do get shadows of the afterlife in the Old Testament. And so, for instance, Bart Ehrman wrote a recent book about the history of the afterlife, and he claims that the Old Testament doesn't really set up for resurrection at all. I would suggest careful reading in the Old Testament would say the opposite. That in the Old Testament, you have these shadows of the afterlife in two main ways. One, an expectation and a promise that justice that falls short in this life would be corrected in the future. This is especially seen in the Psalms where those different psalmists are crying out for God to make right things that are wrong. Okay? But shadows of the afterlife are also seen in the promise and the hope of continued intimate relationship with God after death. And so the relational, personal side of Christianity, both with the individual and with the community, is key throughout the Bible. And so some examples. So Elijah and Enoch, two Old Testament characters, are both taken up to be with God. Even Abraham is described as being gathered to his people. And if you read carefully, that's not just about being buried with relatives. Because in several cases in the Old Testament, they're not buried in the same place as their relatives. Or they're not just being buried in general. So for instance, Joseph is described as being taken up and gathered to his people. But he's not buried for several more years. All right? So this is idea of a good death is held out on promise. And so in general, the righteous died with the hope that God would deliver them from the power of death and Sheol. And so this is expressed oftentimes in the Psalms, oftentimes in the historical books, with this hope that dying in faith and hope that God would deliver. This seems to be the idea when David assumes that he would see his child again. And so at the end of 2 Samuel chapter 12, his child has died, and he says, "Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he won't return to me." And so this idea of continued intimacy. And it really comes into clarity in Daniel chapter 12. If you know, Daniel chapter 12, there's a prophecy specifically about the resurrection of the dead, both to everlasting life and to judgment. And so in the Old Testament, we do see these glimpses, shadows, if you will, of afterlife, primarily described as a relation and intimacy with God. And that's probably why we don't see more, is that in the Old Testament, the focus is often on final resurrection. And so final resurrection at the end of time is usually the hope in the Old Testament because relationship was the key. All right, so then we get to the New Testament. The New Testament picks up these ideas just very quickly. So the New Testament talks both about physical death and spiritual death, both being consequences of sin. It's kind of what we talked about with our diagram here. Oh, and I forgot. So when Jesus comes down on the cross, he takes away the separation. That's kind of the basic biblical storyline there. And so the New Testament picks up the idea that death is the result of sin, both physically and spiritually. But it talks about Jesus opening the way both for restoration relationally with God, right? So Jesus says, if you have known me, you have known my Father. Restoration of relationship, but also restoration of physical life. And so in the New Testament as Christians, we have to think through a couple kind of thorny issues. One is the intermediate state. If you've heard that term, it's just basically talking about the state or condition of mankind between death and resurrection. And so it's the state of mankind between dying now and final resurrection, and also what happens then, the time from an earthly perspective. And so the basic description is that when we are parted from our body, we are present with the Lord. That's how Paul describes it. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Elsewhere, it's described as being safe in God's hands, resting from our labors in joyful satisfaction, living for God's glory, living spiritually as God does. These are the type of things we see come out, for instance, in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Probably not the right parable to build a robust theology of afterlife or intermediate state, but it does bring up kind of three qualities of consciousness, memory, and perception. The reason those three are key is because they come up again and again. In Revelation, for instance, that's the picture of the martyrs who are awaiting final resurrection, and then in Paul's understanding of resurrection as well. And so as the New Testament then talks about physical death, for the Christian it talks about it as sleep, not soul sleep as in an intermediate state of unconsciousness, but rather physical sleep. The body sleeps in the grave while the soul is present with Jesus. And so in that way, for the Christian, death is like sleep, going to sleep and then waking up, both spiritually, waking up with Christ, and then also eventually physically, your body waking up as well. Okay? And so that's very much clear, is that in the intermediate state, the dead are with the Lord. That's what Jesus says to the robber on the cross, that today you will be with me in paradise. Very surely can't mean at some point you can be with me. That's what Jesus says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And so as he is separated soul from spirit from his body lays in the grave, his spirit is with the Lord. Same thing for, like I said in Paul in 2 Corinthians 5, that he depicts the location and the state of the Christian after death, that we prefer to be with the Lord. And so residence, even though the physical body is in the grave. And so that's kind of the intermediate state, what happens when the Christian dies now. And then the final resurrection is very clear in the New Testament. Very clear. And so 6 kind of quick descriptions of the final state. What does the afterlife look like, especially for the Christian? 1, it is embodied. It is physical, right? And so Paul talks about a resurrected body in the same way he talks about Jesus' body. And so that's how Jesus is the prototype. And so he had a physical body that could eat, that could be touched, that could be present on the earth. And that's how they talk about our bodies as well. This is both a rejection of a simply materialistic view of resurrection, that it's just a body resurrected, but no, it's a spiritual body. It's a new glorified body, but it's not just a spiritual body. It's actually a spiritual body, a physical body. Divine in origin, glorious, powerful, angel-like in the sense of being deathless. Localized. So final resurrection, embodied, localized. That place continues to be key if you remember the storyline. That actually place both in the intermediate state, Christians are with the Lord, but then in resurrected bodies, Christians are with God in his place. And so in Revelation especially, there's the idea of God dwelling with his people. The picture is a city. And so present in a localized space. This is why the Bible talks about new heavens and new earth, either through restoration, redemption of the current earth, or through replacement, kind of annihilation and recreation. Either way, the idea is a localized place. It's personal, and so identity is preserved. And so you can think of it this way. It will still be me, you, us. It'll still be me, you, and us. That's how Paul talks about it. That's how Jesus talks about it. That's how the hope is given. That's how Hebrews 11 talks about it for the Old Testament saints. That personal, that identity actually continues. And so I bring up these points, especially as we think through the different views of the afterlife, that Christianity is distinctive in these ways. The afterlife is active, and so Jesus is active now, and Christians will be active as well. And so we're described as worshiping and serving and being present with God and his people. It's corporate, and so even though we will still be individuals, there's no future state of afterlife apart from others. And so neither are we just kind of a drop in the ocean that gets diluted out, and neither are we a drop by ourselves. But the New Testament, the biblical view of an afterlife, is that we are actually corporate, we are together. Similar here. So people in a place with a purpose to be with God and serving him. And finally, permanent. And the idea is that die no more. And this is the promise at the end of Revelation. This is promise of Jesus in John 11, where he tells Mary and Martha, I am the resurrection and life. Whoever lives believing in me will never die. So death won't really be the thing for you. And he who dies believing in me will yet live. Even though you die, your life will continue. And so there's a permanency. So there's no lessening in intimacy, closeness to God, or fruitfulness in service to God. And so the eternal state is permanent, both in closeness and fruitfulness. And so it gets down to the end then. Why do Christians care so much about Easter? Well, 3 kind of quick points on Jesus' resurrection. It's important apologetically, so apology in terms of an argument for Christianity, that Jesus' resurrection, in the words of the disciples, was the reason for their confidence and transformation. And so they went from ordinary people who were not expecting or believing in the resurrection, not doing all that well at following Jesus, to then being convinced and transformed to witness his name and to do what he said. Okay? So it's apologetically important for them in terms of their own testimony. It's also apologetically important because they then claim to be witnesses for the sake of others. That in the New Testament, especially in the books of Acts, the repeated refrain, the repeated message of the first witnesses was that they saw Jesus alive and resurrected. That it was their main argument for why Christianity makes sense. It's why Paul at the end of Corinthians says, if this isn't true, if Jesus wasn't raised, there's no point to it. And so for Christians, it really does come down to the afterlife, especially as achieved and provided in Jesus. So apologetically, it's critical. That's why we care about the Easter. Theologically, it's critical, so what we believe. So if this is the way we understand the world, that there is a good God who would give life and would be the source of good, if we are separated from that God because of our attitude against him and our kind of ingrained desire to go our way instead of his way, then theologically, Jesus' victory over that separation, victory over death, victory over the great enemy devil, this utter ushering in a new age of resurrection life, it's critical. It's where it all rises or falls. And then finally, kind of ethically or pastorally, and so how it cares for us and directs our living. Paul says that because of it, our hope and purpose and our labor is not in vain. And so basically he says because there is an afterlife and because it's been achieved by Jesus, we have hope and purpose in this life, and what we do matters. It's kind of what the other religions, I would suggest, are seeking after as they, especially kind of with the Eastern religions, with all of them. They're all seeking after a life now that matters into the future. Okay? And that's what the resurrection achieves. And then ethically, a belief in the resurrection transformed how Christians faced death and how they interacted with life. And so belief in the resurrection drastically transformed how they lived and how they died. In terms of ethical decisions and behavior, rooting their identity in Jesus who is alive, who promised life to them, was the motivating and empowering factor of their ethics. And if you read church history kind of early on, before all the kind of power and political issues, early church history, it was Christian ethics in combination with witness of the resurrection that transformed the world. And so as you think about evaluating Christianity then, it actually does come down to evaluating the question of life after death. That is the evidence and the storyline, is it plausible and does it make sense of our reality? And so just finally before we do Q&A, Jesus claims that if he lives, then we live too. Paul picks that up and says that if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. It links our hope and our future to this event. And so that's kind of the overview of afterlife, kind of quick view of the religions, quick summary of how it gets played out in the Bible. I would love to take questions. We're getting close to the official close time, and so if you need to jet, of course you can. If you'd like to submit questions, like I said, there's QR codes at the back that just takes you to a Google form, and so you can type it in, and as you use the restroom or get a drink or something, I can look at them, or otherwise we can also take some live questions. So let's take a break, get a snack, a drink. If you want to submit questions, use the QR code, and I hope you do. Questions are really helpful. There's so much that can be said on all these different things, and we're all sharing a lot of the same questions and thoughts. And so let's take a break and come back in about maybe 5 minutes or so. Please don't. Let me see. I know it is. Here. It's right here. Please only do a couple. I'm trying to get it. You have to ask. Is this one about Buddhism? All right, welcome back. Welcome back. Thanks for your patience. The presentation was, of course, longer than needed, but next time we'll go a little shorter. But appreciate you staying and hopefully thinking through some questions will be good for us. So I'll go through questions that are submitted and then open to questions, live questions if you'd like, and we'll see how far we get. All right, first we have a question about part of the Apostles' Creed where Jesus is described as descending into hell. And so if you don't know the Apostles' Creed, a very early confession of belief. And so a very early summary of Christian belief that everyone would agree on. And so in the Apostles' Creed, it does talk about Jesus dying and then descending into hell. I'll say that our current translation of the Apostles' Creed is not as helpful as it could be, in the sense that almost certainly what was being communicated in the original was at least one idea, maybe two. And so at least the idea of Jesus descending into Sheol, the place of the dead, in the sense of his body descending into the grave. And so the New Testament is very clear that Jesus' atoning work on the cross, and so his paying the penalty for sin was accomplished on the cross. And so Jesus talks about it being finished. He talks about his spirit going to God, the symbolism of the curtain of the temple being torn open, the symbolism of the resurrection of the dead happening on the cross. Like all those things happen instantaneously. And so Jesus did not need to descend into hell in a punitive way to pay for sin. So that much is very clear. And so that's not what was meant. It was meant his body descended into the grave. It's also possible that they thought from 1 Peter, Peter talks about Jesus descending into, I don't think it says hell, but actually going to and preaching to the spirits who are in prison. And it's a hard passage to understand, but our best understanding is that in vindication and victory, Jesus then declared his victory to either those who had already died or those perhaps from the time of Noah. There's a fairly obscure passage in the story of Noah where maybe angels were imprisoned in a different way. And so that seems to be what's going on there. And so when we think about Jesus descending into hell, we should think about theologically him finishing the atonement on the cross and physically his body going into the grave. Kind of a question related to that. It's a question of how the New Testament talks about sleep, the Christian sleeping or the body resting in the grave. And the question is, if the body's resting, how can the body be resting if it's totally decomposed after death? This is an interesting question. Actually, Christians have thought about it a lot. And for some Christians, it is an issue of challenge. And so, for instance, like Bart Ehrman, the New Testament critical scholar, he talks about a hypothetical situation where somebody dies in the ocean and their body gets eaten by fish, and then the fish get caught and fed to somebody, and then, ends up in somebody else's body. Like, whose body is it at that point? To be honest, that type of scenario and that question isn't near as challenging to me. For God and Jesus to have the miraculous power to raise from any amount of death is overwhelming miracle power at the very least. We see this, how Jesus demonstrates miraculous power in the Gospels to the paralyzed man. The man is instantly healed. Not only do the legs work again, but the muscles are reformed to where he can walk. Eyes that had never seen are suddenly recreated so that they can see. And so the ability of God to resurrect a decomposed body isn't that much of a question. In terms of what the New Testament means, it's just talking about the fact that our physical bodies remain and wait in kind of both the actual grave, but also the theoretical grave in the sense of they're waiting to be made new again. Okay? All right. You can ask follow-up questions to these. We can't go too far down different lines, but we can do some, especially if you are unsatisfied. Next question. So, how will we retain our identity if there's no marriage in heaven and we're all brothers and sisters? Good question. So if you didn't know, Jesus does talk about marriage and the fact, basically the way this understanding has kind of put all together is that even though we continue to have gender and identity, our relationships are not diminished less than marriage. Our relationships are improved. Actually, the closeness relationally is shared and spread both with Jesus and his people, but then also with each other. And so our identity doesn't become less than we had in marriage, but it actually becomes more. And so Jesus describes the resurrected bodies as being like the angels, not in having no gender, but in having no reproductive. I don't know if desire is the right word, but a change in that way. And so that's the idea, is that we are still who we are, and we are still, except our connection and closeness to other people is expanded greatly. Does that make sense? Danny, does that? Okay. All right, if Jesus is the prototype of the resurrected body, why is Thomas able to place his hands into Jesus' bloody side? Great question. I don't know if it says it was his bloody side. And so I'll clarify that. I'm pretty sure it doesn't say that. But the reason is actually for our good. That Jesus' resurrected body, while glorious to the extent that everyone who saw him wanted to respond with worship, so there was a newness to it, but there was a continuity to it that could affirm Thomas's weak faith. Similar to the picture, it's just a metaphorical picture in Revelation of the lamb who was slain, a lamb looking like it was slain. What a shocking picture, but yet the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And so Jesus' body has a continuity. His resurrected body has continuity with his first earthly body, but yet is also glorified. And we're told the same thing will be for us. And so you could ask follow-up questions like, what age will I be? Like, will I be in better shape or not have gray hair? We don't exactly know. We just know it'll be like me, but it'll be glorified and better and perfect for the uses God wants it to be. Okay. All right. In the description of Buddhism, it was mentioned that diminishing desire is key, yet the applicable behaviors then become more important. And so did desire go away entirely? This is a hard question because I'm not an expert in Christianity, but I'm even less of an expert in Buddhism. The way I think they would describe it is that inappropriate desire, especially desire for the physical world, is what leads to suffering. And so the right path, or the four pillars, is about righting desire and eventually lessening to the point where desire for the physical world or desire for the individual identity is no longer there. And that's why nirvana is described as release or entrance into nothingness or entrance into Hinduism's the cosmic soul. Buddhism, I forget how Buddhism describes it. And so eventually, I do think eventually it would be described as no desire, but the reincarnation process and the enlightenment process is the righting of desire. I think that's fair. All right, if our souls are with Jesus after death, then why the final judgment, since we are already in heaven? Yeah, great question. So the final judgment is described in this way in the Bible. It's confirmation and completion of the promises we have in Jesus. And this is an important thing because in Greek philosophy, for instance, there's a dualism between spirit and body, to where spirit is good and body material is bad. And sometimes people think Christianity is in the same way, and so you'll have visions of heaven as like floating on, clouds with a harp, but very immaterial, as if to get away from this body is the key. But that is not the way the Bible describes it. There is a dualism in the sense that our spirit is separated from our body at death, but that is not the goal. That's not the final state. That's not God's desire. And so God's desire is that we would be like Jesus in resurrected, glorious bodies. And so for the Christian, it's an affirmation of that promise. It's also an affirmation of the completion of Jesus' work in the sense that Jesus promised that this would be so. He promised that his atonement would be effective, not only to our spirit, but also to the resurrection of our body and the resurrection of all things. And so all of that comes true at the final judgment. I'll also say that the final judgment also, there is pretty clear teaching that the final judgment does examine our works. And we are judged based on our response to Jesus and on then the works that flow from that. And so it's also an affirmation of God's power in our life, making us more like Jesus and to do good works. In a similar way, the final judgment affirms God's God's judgment on those who have rejected him. It affirms it in the sense that it becomes clear that he was just to make the judgment. So that's where the final judgment is. It's not that being present with Jesus while our body's in the grave is bad. It's just not final. There's even more. And I think that's, if you read Revelation, as we're going to go through on Sundays, that's the storyline there as well. All right, a question about Judaism in relation to Christianity, and how different are they, and how they relate. And so, certainly for the Christian, because of both the Old Testament promise and then the New Testament application, is that we rightly believe that the Old Testament promises and symbols and covenants are fulfilled and brought to completion in Jesus. And so we very rightly and appropriately receive and claim the promises of God fulfilled in Jesus, the second Adam, the true Israel, all those things. And so there is a change, but it is the foundation of what God has been doing in history. For the Jewish person, it does vary a decent amount. And so there are some Jews who would still be awaiting for God's Messiah to come. And so there are some who would still wait in a way that we've already found. But then there's a lot of Jews who expect God to work in different ways. Or there are some Jews who are very culturally Jewish, but actually practically or even explicitly atheistic in terms of believing no God. And so how we relate to a Jewish person, of course, with care and sensitivity and respect and all those things, and depending on how free they are to express and talk about their belief, it can be great to do it. I actually just found out one of the pastors in New Haven, who I meet with every week, he actually grew up Jewish and became a Christian later in life. And so that's definitely the story that we hope. And I think part of the question is probably the dynamic of we would want to be careful to not be arrogant in claiming in a wrong way the promises that they would see for themselves, but rather we would want to hold open in a positive way that God has fulfilled those promises and even more. Okay. One more. So a difference between Roman Catholic and Protestant Christianity, especially as it relates to afterlife. I didn't touch on this one a lot, and actually I didn't touch on, there is a variety within Christianity very broadly. There's variety within Christianity when it comes to resurrection and the afterlife. There are also groups of people who would claim to be Christian who most Christians would not claim for themselves. So Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, for instance, what they believe about the afterlife, the resurrection, especially the person of Jesus, doesn't really fit within the bounds of Christianity, even though they and lots of other people tend to think that they're Christian. When it comes to Roman Catholics and Christians in particular, a lot of commonalities in terms of hope for the afterlife, belief in a physical resurrection, belief in a final judgment. Some big differences, of course, when it comes to intermediate state. And so I think it's still official Roman Catholic doctrine, believes in purgatory, a time of purification prior to final resurrection. It was a late doctrine. I think it developed in the 13th century. And so in the kind of stream of Christianity, it was pretty late. And I find it especially hard to defend from the Bible. And so there are some big differences. There's also some differences related to how we should interact with people who have passed away in terms of praying for them or doing things like that. So some very big differences, but some commonalities in terms of hope for the resurrection and seeing it through Jesus and having Jesus be the first fruit of promised resurrection. Okay. Final one, how do various religions address suicide? I don't know this one. I don't know the answer to this one very well. Beyond the biblical Christian perspective is that there's only one forgivable sin. Jesus describes it. There's only one unforgivable sin. Jesus, thank goodness. Yeah, Jesus describes it as a blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. It's hard to know exactly what he's saying, but it seems to be basically, if there's a time where the Spirit reveals to us who Jesus is and we reject that, that's unforgivable, which makes sense with how we would be a Christian. We can only be a Christian through Jesus. Beyond that, the Bible gives us no indication that suicide or anything else would be unforgivable. The Bible gives us a lot of indication that the burden and the suffering, both physically, psychologically, emotional, and result of sin is great, and that even Christians are capable of weakness and failure and sin when it comes to valuing life. And so that's the Christian perspective. I don't really know how the other religions would express it. Obviously, like, you're probably familiar with Islam, how it talks about martyrdom. And so martyrdom is basically like a fast track to paradise. But even in Islam, it's not, we think of martyrdom as just like physical war, jihad. Jihad in Islam is more about the struggle to submit to Allah than it is just about physical war, even though that's kind of what it's become more recently. And so even then, I don't know if they would apply martyrdom to suffering for Allah in different ways. And so maybe you could think of suicide coming up in that. But beyond that, I'm out of my depth, so I can't answer that one more. Any other questions? Yeah.
When you were talking about the suffering being coming from desire, what about diseases or suffering, physical ailments or anomalies that cause difficulty? That doesn't seem to fit.
Within Buddhism.
Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of critique, in terms of critique, I would agree with you. In terms of how Buddhism would answer that, I think the way they would answer it is that physical suffering that would cause separation from the body won't be as acute if you're not so closely desiring your body. And so in the progress of enlightenment, you would learn that actually this physical suffering isn't real, in a sense, and not even that big of a deal. And so it becomes less. And so as you have the perspective in this life, then the next life, you kind of develop even further until eventually you get to the point where you realize you're free from it all. I think that's the answer they would give, but obviously I don't find it convincing. And I do find it to be one of the more significant challenges of Buddhism and some of the Eastern religions is that how they interact with suffering. That type of a view definitely influences how we view our suffering, how we view other people's suffering, both in terms of justice, whether it's right or wrong, and in terms of experience, whether it can be mourned or worked against, things like that. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
I read a book once that was written by an emergency room physician, and he said he saw many people dying, and so he was watching and taking notes on what was happening, actually. And what he found out was, everybody talks about having the near-death experience, and there's this wonderful, loving being of light and all this. Said they're not all like that.
Right.
We don't talk about the other ones, but sometimes people come back and say it was rather a negative, very bad experience. Don't let me go. They had this one guy that he kept having to shock his heart to bring him back, and he said, "Don't let me go. Don't let me go. I don't want to go there again." And it was fascinating to me because nobody would talk about that.
Yeah.
If they had that experience, it changes people's lives. Obviously, they come back and they say, "I got to do something different."
Yeah. The reason I didn't cover it, that type of thing here, is certainly time, but also I don't find it to be very fruitful in this type of setting, and I don't find it to be as fruitful as kind of looking at what God's given us in the Bible. Because in this, for instance, like in this example, it can change your life, but it doesn't give you the answers, which is the problem of many of these kind of near-death experiences. If anything, I think there is room to examine and research and study what near-death experiences tell us about the human body and consciousness and things like that. And there's actually, there's academic programs, I think, that are dedicated to that. And so, for instance, does it give us good indication that human consciousness is more than just the physical mind? Maybe. But in terms of faith, it wouldn't give us the answers that God gives us. And even if it gave us pictures of it, as some people have claimed, it wouldn't give us the convincing life that Christianity gives. Because at the end of the day, like this description is hopefully helpful, hopefully it makes sense, but at the end of the day, what the Bible claims and what Christians claim is that the reason anybody would be a Christian is because they would have a real transformative experience with the living person of Jesus. That Jesus is alive today and he's able to convince and transform people, even though he's not physically present in the same way he did with his first disciples. And he says in an even greater way that he's able to do it even more. And so that's really the testimony of Christians, is that they've seen and they've read the evidence, but then a miraculous work has happened. So lots of near-death stuff out there. Probably not harmful to look into, but probably do so with care. And of course, as you know, some of them have been, like I think, Heaven is for Real. I think that one, the author came back and said, actually most of it was made up. So we need to be careful with that. I think that's the one. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's it. All right, unless other burning questions. All right, well, I'm going to close in prayer. At the end of the day, that's my posture, that I am convinced that a man, Jesus Christ, Son of God, is alive today and giving me life and promising me life in the future. And so that's why Christians pray. If you're interested in these things, I do hope you'll join us. So Easter's a great weekend to think about it. Good Friday is primarily the time when Christians remember and affirm what Jesus did on the cross. Easter, mainly remember and affirm what Jesus did in the resurrection. And so if those things in particular would be helpful to think about, joining us on Friday at 6, I believe. Friday at 6 here, or Sunday morning at 9 or 11:15 would be a great chance to think some more. Anyway, let me pray. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for what you've done in our lives. And so I thank you personally for the faith you've given me and the faith you've given other people here. We thank you that you have done it in such a way that we would appropriately be humble and to be dependent on your revelation. Would you help us to live out that humility as we interact with people around us and these other religions and worldviews, that we could find connections or points of contrast that would give an opportunity to express the hope we have. And so we do ask that but the true life that you have offered to us in Jesus, would you make that real and available through us to many others. For what we said tonight, if there are things that would be especially helpful to think through for anyone here, would you work in their minds to answer and to make yourself known to them in special ways. And so we thank you for the Lord Jesus and for his life and for our life in him. And we pray in Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for sticking around.